Have you ever really stopped to think about how a tiny stream of water, something you could step over, can eventually become a force so powerful it carves out canyons and shapes entire continents? Well, today, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to follow the incredible life story of a river right from its birth in the mountains to its final moment meeting the sea, all to understand how running water literally sculpts the world around us.
Now, if you've ever looked at a topographic map, it can feel like you're trying to solve some kind of ancient puzzle, right? It's just covered in all these swirling, abstract lines, and this quote, well, it hits the nail on the head. Cracking that code is pretty much the key to understanding our planet on a whole new level. So how do we do that? How do we turn these squiggles into a real story of huge mountains, deep valleys, and the constant, relentless flow of water? How do we see the action behind the lines? Well, they say the best way to learn a language is to follow a native speaker.
So, we're going to let a river be our guide. We are going to follow the River Tees in northern England for its entire 137-kilometer journey by tracking its life from its source way up in the mountains to its mouth at the North Sea. We're going to unlock the secrets that are hiding in plain sight on that map.
Okay, let's dive right in. Our journey starts high up in the Pennine Mountains, which is where the River Tees is born. And just like any kid, it is absolutely full of energy. Its main mission at this point? To carve its path with some serious, incredible force.
So up here in what we call the upper course, everything is about speed and power. The slope, the gradient, is super steep, so the water is just flying downhill. And all that energy, it isn't spent widening the banks or anything. Nope, it's all focused on one thing: vertical erosion. The river is literally digging straight down into the rock.
So how does it do that? Well, it has this awesome little toolkit with 4 main tools. First, you've got hydraulic action. That's just the sheer force of the water blasting into cracks and ripping rock apart. Then there's corrosion, which is basically the river using rocks and pebbles like sandpaper to grind away at its bed. Attrition is when all those boulders and rocks smash into each other, breaking themselves down. And finally, you have solution, which is basically a chemical attack, where the water actually dissolves certain types of rock.
And what's the result of all this downward force? Well, this relentless cutting carves out those classic, steep, V-shaped valleys you always see in mountains. And as the river has to zigzag around bits of harder rock, it creates what we call interlocking spurs. You can see these really distinctive ridges near a spot called Cauldron Snout on the River Tees.
This process also creates probably the most dramatic feature of a river's youth, a waterfall. Take High Force, for example, the UK's largest. Here, the River Tees flows over a super tough layer of rock, but underneath that, there's softer rock. The river just eats away at that softer rock, creating an overhang which, you guessed it, eventually collapses. And the sheer power of all that falling water carves out a deep plunge pool at the bottom. It's an amazing process.
All right, so as the river leaves the steep mountains, its whole personality changes. It's entering its mature stage, and its energy is now used in a completely different way.
The slope is way gentler now, so the river starts to slow down, and its focus shifts from digging down, that's vertical erosion, to carving outwards, side to side. We call that lateral erosion. And this action is what starts to widen the valley floor, creating these broad, flat areas called floodplains. And with this new side-to-side movement, this kind of dance, the river starts to form these huge looping bends. You've definitely seen them. They're called meanders. At this point, the river's main job isn't so much eroding anymore, but transporting all the sediment it picked up back in the mountains further and further downstream. Okay, now we're on the last leg of the journey. As the river gets closer and closer to the sea, it enters its old age. It's wide, it's slow, and it's carrying this heavy load of sediment from its long trip.
So here in the lower course, the land is almost completely flat. The river has lost pretty much all of its energy, and it just can't carry that heavy load of sand and silt and mud anymore. So what does it do? It starts to drop it. This process is called deposition, and it actually creates brand new landforms.
And this is the cool part. This is where the river stops being a carver and becomes a builder. This deposition is what creates things like the massive estuary of the River Tees. As it finally meets the North Sea, it just drops all its remaining sediment, forming these huge mud flats and sandbanks, literally building new land right out into the sea.
But hold on, running water isn't just an artist on the surface, it also has this secret life, working quietly but incredibly powerfully right underneath our feet as groundwater.
So, in places with rock like limestone, which dissolves in water, groundwater can act like a hidden river.
just eating away at the rock from below. And if the roof of one of these underground channels gets too thin, well, it can suddenly collapse. And boom, you've got a sinkhole.
Now, when that same process of underground erosion goes on for thousands or even millions of years, it can carve out these unbelievably huge and spectacular underground chambers that, well, we know them as caves.
So what about those amazing formations you see inside caves? How do you remember which is which? It's actually super simple. There's a little trick. The ones that hang tight to the ceiling are stalactites. Get it? Tight. The ones that build up from the floor and might one day reach the top are stalagmites. Might. See? Easy?
So, after following our river all the way from its source to the sea, let's go back to that map, that confusing one we started with. Does it look a little different to you now?
Let's just put it all together real quick. We saw the river in its youth, high energy, digging straight down, carving those V-shaped valleys. Then, in its maturity, less energy, carving sideways, making those big, lazy meanders. And finally, in its old age, super low energy, dropping all its sediment, building things like estuaries. And all the while, we can't forget about that secret agent water, working underground, making caves and sinkholes.
So you see, those lines on a map aren't just abstract squiggles anymore, are they? Where the lines are all packed tightly together, you can now see the steep V-shaped valleys of a young river. Where they spread way apart, you can picture the wide, flat floodplains of a river in its old age. You can actually read the story of a landscape now. The journey of a river shows us that even the most solid landscapes are always changing, shaped by forces we might not even see. It kind of leaves you with a final thought, doesn't it? If a river can slowly